The chainmail was a cold vice against my chest, a persistent weight I had yearned for since boyhood. Yet now, beneath the unforgiving Syrian sun, it felt less like armor and more like a shroud waiting to be cinched tight. I stood motionless in the pre-dawn gray, the air already thick with the scent of dry earth, horse sweat, and the lingering wood smoke of dying watchfires. My breath plumed weakly in the chill that precedes the desert morning, a transient thing, much like the lives of the men standing shoulder to shoulder with me in this alien land. I traced the crimson cross emblazoned upon my white surcoat with a gauntleted hand, the wool ruff beneath the steel rings. It was pristine, untarnished by mud or blood, a stark canvas crying out for the defilement of war. I was 18 years of age, a newly minted brother of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, and I had never killed a man. The silence of the encampment was heavy, punctuated only by the jingling of a bridle or the murmured Latin of a final confession. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone and iron, its rhythm horribly out of sync with the measured, stoic breathing of the veteran knights around me. They stood like weathered statues carved from granite, men whose souls had long since been tempered in the fires of Outremer, their fear distilled into a cold, lethal duty. I was fluid, trembling, a vessel overflowing with a nauseating cocktail of pious zeal and abject childish terror. I closed my eyes, seeking the face of Christ in the darkness behind my lids, praying not for victory, that belonged to God alone, but merely for the strength to not shame the cross I bore when the screaming began. The journey to this desolate plain, wedged between the jagged spine of the mountains and the shimmering heat haze of the desert, seemed a lifetime ago. I remembered the cool green dampness of my father's estate in Aquitaine, the smell of rain on rich soil, so unlike this parched and hungry dust that coated the back of my throat. I remembered kneeling on the flagstones of the preceptory chapel near Paris, the bishop's hands heavy on my head, the smell of incense and beeswax candles drowning out the world. I had renounced noble birth, inheritance, and the soft comforts of a secular life to don the mantle of poverty, chastity, and obedience. It had felt glorious then, a grand romantic immolation of the self for a higher calling. I had dreamed of riding down Saracen hordes, my sword a flaming instrument of divine justice. How naive those dreams seemed now, evaporated by the brutal reality of the march from Acre. We had ridden for weeks through terrain that seemed cursed by God, a landscape of thorns and broken rocks where the sun was a physical antagonist, hammering our helms until our skulls felt ready to split. The water in our leather skins grew hot and foul, rationing became strict, and the discipline of the order was the only thing holding the column together. I had watched good horses die of exhaustion, their sides heaving, their eyes rolling back in their heads, and I had seen the grim acceptance on the faces of their riders as they slit their throats and continued on foot. It was a crucible that burned away the softness of Europe, but it had yet to replace it with the hardened resolve of the Templar warrior. I was merely endured by the older brothers, a novice whose zeal exceeded his utility, a liability waiting to be tested when the steel finally sang. For 3 days we had tracked the army of Saladin's lieutenant, a vast shadowing force that moved like smoke through the wadis to the east. They knew we were here. Their scouts, swift riders on lean Arabian horses, watched us from the high ridges, silhouettes against the blinding sky, vanishing whenever we sent guards in pursuit. The tension in our ranks had ratcheted tighter with each league we covered, a wound spring threatening to snap. We were vastly outnumbered. Even a green novice could read that in the grim conferences held between our Grand Master and the barely tolerated secular barons who rode with us. Last night the enemy campfires had stretched across the horizon like a reflection of the stars, a countless multitude surrounding our small island of Christian steel. The sound of their drums had throbbed through the ground all night, a relentless deep heartbeat that echoed in the pits of our stomachs, denying us rest, fraying our nerves. It was psychological warfare, a reminder of the overwhelming wave that was about to crash upon us. I had spent the hours on my knees in the dirt, my sword planted before me like a cross, reciting patters until my lips were numb, trying to drown out the drums with prayer. Brother Thomas, a scarred bear of a man who had survived the slaughter at Jacob's Ford, had knelt beside me for a time. He did not offer empty comforts. "Fear is the devil's weapon, boy," his voice had rumbled, gravel soaked in wine. "It will tell you to run. It will tell you that your life is worth more than your vows. When that moment comes, and it will come today, you do not listen to your mind. You listen only to the cross on your chest. You hold the line until God calls you home or the enemy breaks." His words had chilled me more than the night air, for they confirmed the existence of the very cowardice I feared harbored within me. Dawn broke not with sunlight, but with noise. The Saracen horns ripped the air, a harsh, discordant braying that signaled the end of waiting. The drums accelerated into a frenzied thunder. Around me, the order moved with terrifying swiftness. Helms were secured, shield straps tightened, lances lifted from the rests. The transition from silent contemplation to martial readiness was instantaneous, a collective inhalation before the plunge. We mounted our destriers, heavy beasts draped in white caparisons that mirrored our own surcoats. My horse, a roan stallion named Bohemond, caught my nervousness, dancing sideways, champing at the bit. I struggled to control him, shame burning my cheeks as I felt the eyes of the veterans on my clumsy efforts. We formed our squadron into a dense wedge, knee to knee, a solid wall of horseflesh, kite shields, and leveled lances. I was in the second rank, sandbagged between men whose prowess I could only dream of matching. The order came to advance at a walk. We crested a low rise, and there they were. The Saracen army filled the valley below like a turbulent sea of colored silks, shimmering steel and darker banners emblazoned with crescents and strange script. The sheer scale of it stole the breath from my lungs. There were thousands of them, light cavalry wheeling in complex patterns, dense blocks of archers, and heavy Mamluk lancers in lamellar armor that glinted menacingly. A great cry went up from their ranks, "Allahu Akbar," rolling towards us like a physical blow. My mouth was impossibly dry, my hands slick with sweat inside my gauntlets. I gripped my lance until my knuckles turned white, fearing I would drop it and disgrace myself before the first blow was struck. This was the precipice. The theoretical martyrdom I had contemplated in chapels was now a roaring, tangible reality composed of thousands of men who wished to butcher me. The master's voice cracked like a whip over the din. "Pour le beau sur Dieu. Chargez." The walk became a trot, the trot a canter, and then, with a collective roar of "Beauseant," we spurred our horses into a full gallop. The earth shook beneath the thundering hooves of 500 heavy cavalry. It was a sensation of unstoppable power, a divine wind at our backs pushing us towards destiny. The air darkened as a cloud of Saracen arrows hissed toward us. I flinched, instinctively ducking behind my shield. I heard them pattering against the wood, ringing off helmets thudding into horseflesh. A brother 2 ranks ahead of me was struck in the throat, thrown backward over his saddle, his lance cartwheeling into the dirt. There was no time to grieve, no time to think. We were upon them. The impact was indescribable, a horrific crunch of wood splintering, metal deforming, and bodies crushed. My lance struck a wicker shield, punching through it and the man behind it with jarring force. The ashwood shaft snapped in my hands and I discarded the useless stump, drawing my broadsword as Bohemond shouldered his way deep into the enemy mass. It was immediate chaos. The disciplined lines dissolved into a swirling melee of hacking blades and terrified horses. I swung my sword wildly, guided more by panic than skill, the blade biting into turbans and leather armor. Blood sprayed, hot and blinding. The screams of men and horses merged into a deafening cacophony. I took a blow to my helm that rang my head like a church bell, dazing me. Another strike glanced off my shoulder mail, bruising the bone beneath. I was drowning in the violence, a small cork tossed on an ocean of slaughter. The battle raged for what felt like hours, though it may only have been minutes. The sun beat down mercilessly, heating my armor until I felt I was cooking alive in my own sweat. My sword arm grew leaden, every swing an agonizing effort. We were surrounded, cut off from the main Christian host. The Saracens swarmed like angry wasps, their curved scimitars flashing everywhere. I saw Brother Thomas fall, pulled from his saddle by hooked spears, disappearing beneath a mob of attackers without a sound. A sob tore from my throat. We were dying. The realization hit me not with sadness, but with a paralyzing terror. The line was buckling. A gap opened up to my left, a clear path through the thinning enemy ranks towards the rocky hills and potential safety. It was an invitation to live. Every instinct screamed at me to turn Bohemond's head, to dig my spurs into his flanks and flee this abattoir. I could discard my white mantle, hide in the hills, perhaps make my way to the coast. No one would know. Most of my brothers were dead or dying. Who was left to judge me save God? And was he not silent amidst this carnage? I looked toward the gap, my heart turning traitor. Then, through the dust and smoke, I saw the squadron standard, the black and white Beauséant, wavering. The knight holding it was beset on all sides, his horse hamstrung, sinking to its knees. If the standard fell, the remaining morale of our pocket would shatter utterly. I looked at the path to freedom, then at the falling banner of Christ's temple. The fear did not leave me. It remained, a cold sickness in my gut. But something else rose to meet it. A terrible, agonizing weight of obligation. The words of my vows, spoken in the cool quiet of France, echoed over the screams of the dying Syrian plain. Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but unto thy name give glory. To run now was to spit upon the cross I wore. It was to make a lie of my entire existence. With a cry that was half prayer, half scream of despair, I wrenched Bohemond's reins away from the open path and drove him back into the thickest press, towards the falling standard. I crashed into the Saracens surrounding the banner-bearer, swinging my sword with a manic, desperate energy born of knowing I was already dead. I cut down a man reaching for the flagstaff, then another. I placed my horse between the fallen knight and his attackers, forming a one-man shield wall. Blows rained down on me. My shield was hacked to splinters. A scimitar slashed across my thigh, finding the gap in my mail, and the burning agony nearly unhorsed me. I fought on, blurring vision filled with blood and dust, no longer seeking survival, but only to buy time, to hold the sacred colors aloft for one more moment. I was surrounded, overwhelmed, my strength failing with the blood running down my leg. Yet in that absolute embrace of death, a strange, cold clarity took hold. I was not running. I was a Templar. The world ended in darkness and pain. When consciousness returned, it was slow and fragmented. I was being dragged, the rough ground scraping my armor. The sounds of battle had faded to distant shouts and the moans of the wounded. I was dumped unceremoniously onto hard earth. Opening my eyes, I saw the evening sky, stained purple and blood red. I was in a makeshift collection point for the dead and dying. A Hospitaller Knight, his black surcoat stained dark, was leaning over me, cutting away the mail from my ruined thigh. The pain was blinding, and I cried out. "Be silent, brother," the Hospitaller muttered, his voice thick with exhaustion. "You live. That is more than most today." I tried to sit up, looking frantically around. "The standard," I rasped, my throat raw. "The Beauséant. Did it fall?" The Hospitaller paused in his grim work, looking down at me with strange eyes. "The standard was recovered. The main host broke through to us before the end. We hold the field, God help us." He poured strong wine onto my wound, and I blacked out again from the agony. When I woke next, it was full night. The stars were terrifyingly bright above the desert. I lay among the rows of wounded, the smell of blood and sickness thick in the air. My war was over for now. I touched the cross on my chest. It was stiff with dried gore, no longer pristine. I was alive, maimed, and utterly changed. The boy who had feared cowardice was dead on that field. The man who remained knew that honor was not the absence of fear, but the terrifying choice to walk into the fire regardless. I closed my eyes and finally, truly prayed, the silence inside me heavier than any armor. The agony in my leg was a separate entity, a demon that had taken up residence within my flesh, pulsing with a rhythm that mocked the beating of my own heart. For days, time lost its structure, dissolving into a feverish haze of blinding sun and shivering cold. The field hospital was a canvas of misery, a purgatory of canvas tents flapping in the dry wind, smelling of vinegar, stale blood, and the sickly sweet rot of gangrene. I lay on a pallet of straw that was never quite dry, listening to the rasping breaths of men dying by inches. The glory of the charge, the thundering hooves, the clarion call of the trumpets, all had evaporated, leaving behind only the butcher's bill. My world had shrunk to the few feet of ground I occupied and the terrifying visits of the hospitaller surgeon. He was a man of grim efficiency, his hands stained with the fluids of suffering, who probed my torn muscle with instruments that felt like red-hot iron. I bit down on a strip of leather until my jaw ached, refusing to scream, for I was a Templar, and our rule forbade the indulgence of pain. Yet in the silence of the deep night, when the candles burned low and the only sound was the wind hissing through the scrub, tears of sheer physical exhaustion would leak from my eyes, hot and shameful tracks in the dust coating my face. I prayed then, not the structured Latin of the office, but jagged, desperate pleas for the strength to endure the crushing weight of my own mortality. We could not stay in that valley of death. The army had to move, for water was scarce and the stench of the unburied dead was beginning to poison the air. I was told that Bohemond, my brave roan, had not survived the battle, hamstrung in the melee. The news struck me with a grief as sharp as the loss of a limb. That horse had been my partner, my legs, my strength. Now I was reduced to the ignominy of the baggage train. To be a knight is to ride. To be cast into a wagon, jostled among the camp followers, the supplies and the maimed, was a humiliation that burned deeper than my wound. The journey to the coast was a via dolorosa. The wagon possessed no springs, and every rut in the ancient road sent shocks of agony shooting up my thigh, turning my vision white. I lay on my back, watching the relentless blue sky, a vast, indifferent dome under which we crawled like ants. Dust coated my tongue, my eyelashes, my soul. I saw the backs of the knights riding ahead, their posture upright, their armor gleaming, and I felt a bitter, corrosive envy. I had stood my ground. I had saved the standard. I had done my duty. Yet here I was, broken debris left in the wake of the war machine. It was a spiritual trial, a testing of my vow of poverty, for I was poor now in health and dignity, stripped of the warrior's agency I had so idolized. One evening, as the column halted near a brackish well, Brother Thomas came to the wagon. I had thought him dead, consumed by the Saracen horde, but he walked towards me, battered and limping, his shield arm bound in bloody linen, his face a mask of purple bruising and dried cuts. He looked like a revenant, a dead man walking, yet his eyes burned with an undimmed fire. He peered over the edge of the cart, his gaze assessing my condition with brutal honesty. "You live," he grunted, the words scraping through a throat damaged by smoke and thirst. "I saw you go back, for the banner." I nodded weakly, unable to find my voice. He reached out with his good hand and gripped my shoulder, his fingers digging into the muscle. "You bought us time. That time bought us the flank. Do not pity yourself for this." He gestured to the wagon. "The sword is the easy part, boy. The steel is simple. This..." He looked around at the dusty, miserable camp, the flies, the groaning wounded. "This is the anvil. God is hammering you now. Do not break." He dropped a small skin of water by my head, a king's ransom in that parched land, and limped away before I could thank him. His words lodged in my mind, a hard kernel of truth to chew on during the long, fevered nights. The anvil. I was being forged, shaped by a hammer I could not see for a purpose I could not yet understand. We eventually reached the fortress of Tortosa, a massive imposition of stone rising from the sea, its walls battered by the salt spray of the Mediterranean. The air here was different, cleaner, heavy with moisture, promising life. I was carried into the cool, vaulted halls of the infirmary, a sanctuary of stone and silence run by the order. Here, the frantic urgency of the march was replaced by the slow, rhythmic discipline of recovery. Weeks bled into months. The wound in my thigh closed slowly, leaving a jagged, ugly scar that puckered the skin and tightened the muscle. I had to learn to walk again, first with crutches, then with a heavy cane, dragging the leg that felt stiff and wooden. I spent my days in the chapel, kneeling awkwardly on one knee, staring at the crucifix. The face of Christ seemed different to me now, not the serene victor, but the suffering servant, the God who bled. I understood the blood now. I understood the cost. The other brothers treated me with a new, quiet respect. I was no longer the green novice from Aquitaine. I was one of the initiated, a man who had looked into the abyss and not blinked. But the praise felt hollow. I felt diminished, less than whole. I watched from the ramparts as galleys arrived from the west, disgorging fresh knights eager and unscarred, their surcoats blindingly white. They looked at the Holy Land with the same romantic hunger I once had, and I felt a profound, ancient pity for them. They did not know. They could not know. As my strength returned, so did the restlessness. The master of the house, a stern, gray-bearded veteran named Godfrey, summoned me to the solar one rain-swept afternoon. He stood by the arrow slit, watching the gray waves crash against the rocks below. "Your leg heals, brother," he said without turning. "But you walk with a limp. It will not hinder you in the saddle, but on foot, you are compromised." I stood silent, fearing the worst, that I would be sent back to Europe to a commandery in some sleepy French province to collect tithes and train horses until I died of old age. The thought was a cold stake through my heart. "I can fight, master," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Put me on a horse and I can fight." Godfrey turned, his eyes hard as flint. "We have need of fighters, yes, but the order needs more than swords today. We need men who understand the weight of the banner." He walked to the table and unrolled a map of parchment, the ink faded and stained. "There is a relic," he said quietly. "A fragment of the true cross, held in a small chapel in the mountains near Tripoli. The area is unstable. Bandits, Saracen raiders, betrayal. It needs to be brought here, to the safety of the temple." He looked at me, weighing my soul. "It is not a mission for an army. It is a mission for a few, men who can endure, men who will not run when the odds are impossible." I felt the pull of the challenge, the familiar tightening in my chest, but stripped of the naive excitement of my youth. This was not a charge into glory. This was a task of shadows and endurance. "I am ready," I said, and for the first time since the battle I felt the truth of the words. Godfrey nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Good. You leave at first light. Take 3 men. And brother?" He paused, his gaze dropping to my scarred leg. "Do not seek to die. The martyr's crown is a gift, not a demand. Your duty is to the cross, not to your own pride." I left the solar, the sound of the sea roaring in my ears, a sound that matched the turbulent blood in my veins. I went to the stables. I had been assigned a new mount, a heavy black destrier with a white star on his forehead, a beast of temper and power. I ran my hand along his neck, feeling the warm, living strength of him. I checked my sword, the edge honed to a razor, the leather grip worn by my own hand. I was broken, yes. I was scarred. But as I looked out over the walls towards the dark, looming shapes of the mountains in the east, I knew that the fire had not consumed me. It had merely burned away everything that was not essential. I was a Templar, and the road was calling my name again. The ascent into the Lebanon mountains was a slow, grinding torture that tested the limits of my recovery. We left the coast behind, the blue expanse of the Mediterranean disappearing into a haze of heat and distance, replaced by the crushing verticality of gray limestone and dark cedar forests. There were 4 of us. Myself, Brother Thomas, whose grim silence was more comforting than any speech, a young, wiry knight named Hugh from the Welsh marches, whose eyes darted constantly to the ridgelines, and Bashir, a Turcopole guide who knew the goat paths that passed for roads in this unforgiving country. The air grew thin and cold, biting through our cloaks, a sharp contrast to the furnace of the plains. My leg, though healed, throbbed with a deep, dull ache that synchronized with the plodding rhythm of my black destrier. Every lurch of the horse sent a spike of fire through the knitted muscle, a constant physical reminder of my frailty. I grit my teeth, refusing to complain, conscious of Thomas watching me from beneath the cowl of his cloak. He knew the pain I carried, just as he knew the geography of these mountains, but in the order, suffering was not a currency to be spent on sympathy. It was an offering to be consumed in silence. We rode in single file, shadows stretching long and distorted against the canyon walls, a small steel-clad procession moving into the throat of the world. The landscape was hostile, a place where the earth itself seemed to resent our presence. The path wound along the edges of sheer drops where a single misstep meant a fall of 1,000 feet into the rocky gorges below. The wind here did not blow. It screamed, tearing through the ravines with a voice that sounded like the lamentations of the damned. It stripped the warmth from our bodies and whipped the horses' manes into tangled frenzies. We spoke little. The acoustics of the mountains were treacherous. A loose stone clattering could sound like a landslide, and a spoken word could carry for miles. We communicated with hand signals and subtle nods, a language of brotherhood forged in the necessity of survival. At night, we camped in shallow caves or beneath the overhang of great boulders, lighting no fires for fear of alerting the eyes that surely watched from the peaks. We ate hard bread and dried meat that tasted of salt and dust, huddled together for warmth. In those dark hours, huddled against the biting chill, the brotherhood became tangible. It was not in grand speeches, but in the way Hugh offered me the last of the waterskin, or how Thomas took the first watch without a word, allowing me to stretch my stiffening leg. We were a single organism, breathing in unison, bound by the red crosses on our chests and the shared knowledge that death was walking the ridge just above us. On the third day, the atmosphere shifted. The wind died down, replaced by a suffocating, unnatural silence. The birds, which had been scarce, vanished entirely. Even the insects seemed to have held their breath. We were nearing the village of Arca, a small Christian settlement that clung to the mountainside, guarding the approach to the chapel where the relic lay. Bashir stopped his horse, his head cocked to the side, sniffing the air like a hunting dog. "Smoke," he whispered, the word hanging heavy in the stillness. Old smoke. And something else. I smelled it too, a copper tang that cut through the scent of pine and resin. It was the smell of the battlefield, the scent of spilled iron. Thomas drew his sword, the sound of steel on leather loud in the quiet. "Shields up," he commanded, his voice low and hard. "We ride ready." I unhooked my heater shield, the weight familiar and reassuring on my left arm, and loosened the blade in its scabbard. My heart began that familiar frantic drumming, but unlike before, panic did not paralyze me. I pushed it down, focusing on the weight of the stirrups, the feel of the reins, the discipline of the drill. We crested the final ridge and looked down upon Arca. It was a ruin. The stone hovels were blackened shells, their roofs collapsed. The small terraced fields were trampled into mud. There was no movement, no sound of livestock, no crying of children. We descended slowly, our horses picking their way through the debris. The bodies lay where they had fallen. Men, women, and animals, bloated and buzzing with flies in the mountain sun. It had not been a battle. It had been an extermination. The brutality of it was precise and efficient. "Saracen raiders?" Hugh asked, his voice wavering slightly as he looked upon the corpse of a goat herder pinned to a doorframe. Thomas shook his head, his eyes scanning the cliffs above us. "Too quiet. Raiders take slaves. They take cattle. This was a culling. They wanted no witnesses." We rode through the street of the dead, the hooves of our horses splashing in puddles that were too dark to be water. The church stood at the far end of the village, a sturdy structure of local stone built into the cliff face itself. Its doors were smashed inward, hanging on twisted hinges. We dismounted in the small square before the church. "Bashir, hold the horses," I ordered, surprising myself with the authority in my voice. "Hugh, watch the ridge. Thomas, with me." We stepped over the threshold into the gloom of the sanctuary. The interior had been ransacked, icons smashed, the altar stripped of its cloth. But there, behind the wrecked altar, the stone slab covering the crypt had been pried open. My stomach turned over. Had we come too late? Had the relic been taken? Thomas moved to the crypt, peering into the darkness, then reached down and pulled something out. It was a small, unassuming wooden box, wrapped in oilcloth. He opened it, revealing a shard of dark, ancient wood encased in silver. "They missed it," he breathed, a rare look of wonder crossing his scarred face. "They tore the world apart for gold, and missed the treasure." He handed the box to me. "Secure it, brother, next to your skin." I placed the relic inside my tunic, feeling the cold silver against my chest, a heavy, radiating point of gravity. "We leave. Now," Thomas said, turning back to the entrance. But as we stepped out into the blinding sunlight, the silence of the mountains was shattered. A thwack, wet and sickening, echoed through the square. Bashir gasped, looking down at the black-fletched arrow that had blossomed suddenly in his chest. He slumped forward, the reins slipping from his fingers. "Ambush!" Hugh screamed, raising his shield just as a hail of arrows descended from the cliffs above. They clattered against the stone, sparked off our helmets, and thudded into the earth. My horse reared, screaming as an arrow grazed its flank. "Get to cover!" I roared, dragging the terrified beast towards the shelter of the church wall. We were trapped. The cliffs were alive with movement, men in dark robes moving with fluid, spider-like agility among the rocks. These were not the rank-and-file soldiers of Saladin. These were the assassins, the Nizaris, killers of the mountains who struck from the shadows. We huddled against the stone wall of the church, the air filled with the hiss of arrows. Bashir lay dead in the open, our path to the lower valley cut off. "They have the high ground," Hugh shouted over the din, his face pale behind his nasal bar. "We cannot ride out." Thomas looked at the narrow defile leading up the mountain, a treacherous goat path behind the church that led to the higher peaks. "We cannot go back," Thomas growled, blocking a shaft with his shield. "We go up, into the snow. It is the only way they do not watch." It was a desperate plan. To climb higher was to court death by exposure, to trap ourselves against the sky. But to stay was to die in this slaughterhouse. "My leg," I said through gritted teeth, looking at the steep, jagged track. "I will slow you." Thomas grabbed my gorget, pulling my face close to his. "Then you climb until your heart bursts, Templar. You carry the cross. You do not stop. You do not fall. Now move." We abandoned the horses, a painful sacrifice, slapping their rumps to scatter them and create confusion. We ran for the path, the arrows nipping at our heels like angry hornets. The incline was brutal, a near vertical scramble over loose shale and ice-slicked rock. My legs screamed in protest, every step a fresh tear in the fabric of my endurance. I used my hands, clawing at the roots and stone, dragging my dead weight upward. Above us, the assassins emerged from their cover, realizing our intent. They dropped from the ledges, curved daggers in hand, silent and lethal. The first one fell upon Hugh, a blur of dark cloth and steel. Hugh caught the blow on his shield, thrusting his sword upward in a savage riposte that took the man in the gut. But another was behind him. I lunged forward, forgetting the pain, my sword swinging in a desperate arc. I caught the attacker in the neck, feeling the jar of impact up my arm. He fell away, tumbling into the void. We were fighting not for victory but for inches. Every step gained was bought with blood and sweat. The air grew thinner, the cold sharper, as we ascended into the clouds, the sounds of pursuit close behind us, a pack of wolves chasing wounded deer into the killing, freezing heights. I did not look back. I looked only at the rock in front of me, and felt the relic pressing against my heart. A heavy, silent promise that I would not die today, not while I held the wood of the true cross. The mountain loomed above, indifferent and vast, and we climbed into its icy embrace, the hunt beginning in earnest. The air grew so thin it felt as though we were breathing through wet wool. We had ascended beyond the tree line, leaving behind the jagged gray rocks for a world of blinding whiteness and suffocating cold. The transition was not gradual. It was a violent assault on the senses. One moment we were scrambling over shale, sweat freezing on our brows, and the next we were thigh-deep in drifts of powder that concealed treacherous fissures in the ice. My leg, which had been a throbbing torment in the valley, was now a numb, dead weight. A log of wood I was forced to drag through the snow. I could no longer feel the foot inside the boot, only the jarring shock that rattled my teeth whenever I put weight on it. I fell constantly, my hands tearing at the frozen crust, my chainmail acting as a heat sink that leached the warmth from my core with terrifying efficiency. Each time I stumbled, the black despair of exhaustion whispered to me to stay down, to let the snow cover me like a blanket. It would be so easy. It would be so quiet. But then Thomas's hand would grab my harness, hauling me up with a grunt of exertion, or Hugh would offer his shoulder, his eyes wide and fearful, silently begging me not to become a corpse he would have to leave behind. We were ants crawling up the face of a glacier, insignificant specks against the indifferent majesty of God's creation. The pursuit did not cease. The assassins were not men of flesh and blood. They were wraiths, shadows that detached themselves from the rock face to harry us. We could not see them, but we felt them, a pebble clattering down from a ledge above, an unnatural shifting of the snow to our left, the sense of eyes boring into our backs. They were hurting us, pushing us higher into the killing zone where the elements would finish what their daggers had started. We reached a narrow traverse, a ledge of ice barely wide enough for a man, with a sheer drop into a mist-filled abyss on one side and a vertical wall of granite on the other. The wind here was a physical force, a giant hand trying to peel us from the mountain. We roped ourselves together with a length of frayed cord Thomas had salvaged, a lifeline that was also a death pact. If one fell, we all fell. I went in the middle, the relic pressing hard and cold against my ribs, a reminder of the burden that outweighed our lives. We moved inches at a time, testing the ice with our sword points, the metal ringing sharp and clear in the howling gale. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm, terror battling with the sheer physical necessity of placing one foot in front of the other. We were halfway across the traverse when they struck. There was no battle cry, no warning. Two figures dropped from the overhang above, landing cat-like on the narrow ledge between Hugh and me. They were wrapped in heavy furs over their dark robes, their faces obscured by scarves, only their eyes visible, hard, dark beads void of humanity. The rope snapped taut as the impact knocked Hugh to his knees. The assassin closest to him lunged, a curved dagger flashing towards Hugh's throat. I screamed a warning, but the wind tore the sound away. Hugh, driven by pure instinct, raised his arm, taking the blade through his forearm. He grappled with the man, the two of them teetering on the brink of the abyss. The second assassin turned to me. I had no room to swing my sword, no leverage to maneuver. He came at me low, aiming to drive me over the edge. I dropped my blade, a terrible sin for a knight but necessary, and caught his wrist with both hands, the impact slamming me back against the rock wall. We locked eyes for a second, an intimate moment of violence, his breath smelling of onions and rot. He was strong, wiry, and relentless, pushing me towards the drop. My bad leg buckled. I slipped, one boot sliding over the edge into nothingness. "Thomas!" I roared, my grip slipping on the assassin's wrist. The rope jerked violently. Thomas, anchored behind me, had wrapped the cord around a protrusion of rock and thrown his weight back. The tension held me suspended, half over the void. With a roar of effort, Thomas hauled on the rope, pulling me and the struggling assassin back towards the wall. The movement threw my attacker off balance. I released his wrist and drove my armored gauntlet into his face, feeling the cartilage of his nose collapse. He reeled back, his feet finding only air. There was no scream, only the scuff of leather on ice, and then he was gone, swallowed by the white mist below. I looked to Hugh. He was on his back, his dagger buried in the chest of the other attacker, his face splashed with bright arterial blood. He was shaking uncontrollably, his eyes fixed on the dead man on top of him. "Up!" Thomas bellowed, pulling us forward. "They will not stop. Move!" We scrambled over the body, leaving my sword behind on the ice, a piece of my soul abandoned to the mountain, and threw ourselves around the bend of the cliff, collapsing into a small, wind-scoured cave just as a fresh volley of arrows shattered against the rock where we had stood moments before. Night fell with the suddenness of a closing coffin. The cave offered shelter from the wind, but the cold was absolute. We huddled together in the darkness, a tangled pile of limbs and cloaks, sharing what little warmth remained in our bodies. We dared not light a fire. The light would be a beacon to our hunters. Hugh was shivering violently, the shock of the wound and the cold sending him into delirium. I tore a strip from my surcoat to bind his arm, the wool stiff with frozen blood. He gripped my hand, his fingers like ice. "We will die here," he whispered, his teeth chattering. "God has forsaken this place. It is too high for him to see." I looked at Thomas. The older knight was staring out at the mouth of the cave where the stars were beginning to emerge, hard and brilliant diamonds in the black sky. "God is in the silence, Hugh," Thomas said softly. "He is in the cold. He is in the suffering. Do not mistake comfort for his presence." He reached into his pack and brought out a piece of hardtack, breaking it into 3 equal pieces. It was dry and tasteless, but we ate it with the reverence of the Eucharist. I felt the box against my chest, the sharp corners digging into my skin. I pulled it out, the silver glinting faintly in the starlight. "Why?" I asked, the question that had been gnawing at me since Arca. "Why us? Why this?" "It is just wood, Thomas. We are men. We are flesh." Thomas turned his gaze to the relic. "It is not the wood, brother. It is the memory. It is the promise that death is not the end. Men need that promise more than they need bread or breath. If we fall, the cross falls. If the cross falls, hope falls. We carry the weight so that others do not have to." He looked at me, his eyes softening for the first time. "And you, brother, you carry it well. Better than I thought you would." It was a meager praise, but coming from him, it felt like a knighthood. I put the box back, feeling a strange warmth spreading from it, not physical, but something deeper. A tether anchoring me to the world when everything else tried to blow me away. We slept in shifts, fitful and haunted by the knowledge that the assassins were out there, waiting for the dawn or a moment of weakness. When it was my turn to watch, I sat at the cave entrance, my dagger drawn, my only remaining weapon. The mountains were silent now, a vast, frozen graveyard. I looked down at my leg. The pain had returned, a deep, gnawing ache that felt like the bone was being ground to dust. I thought of the sunny vineyards of Aquitaine, of the girl I had once smiled at in the village square, of the life I could have had. It seemed like a story told about a stranger. That boy was gone. In his place was a creature of ice and pain, a vessel for a holy relic, sitting on the roof of the world waiting for death. I began to pray, but the words froze on my lips. Instead, I simply listened to the wind, and in the wind I heard the drums of the Saracens, the screams of the dying at the battle, and the silence of the falling snow. I realized then that the war was not just in the valley. The war was here. The war was everywhere. And the only victory was to endure one more heartbeat, one more breath, one more sunrise. Dawn brought no warmth, only a gray, flat light that revealed the precariousness of our position. We were near the summit of the pass. Below us, the clouds formed a churning sea of gray. Above, the peaks pierced the sky like jagged teeth. We had to move. Stiffness had seized our limbs. Getting up was an act of supreme will. Hugh was pale, his eyes glassy with fever, but he stood. Thomas checked the bindings on his feet. "The summit," he said, pointing to a notch in the rock ridge above. "Beyond that, the descent to the coast. The assassins are creatures of the shadows. They will not follow us into the open snowfields on the other side in daylight. We have to reach the crest." We stepped out of the cave, the snow crunching loudly under our boots. I took the lead this time, breaking the trail, using my dagger as an ice pick to pull myself up the slope. My leg dragged, a useless anchor, but I did not stop. We climbed for an hour, then 2, We were so high that the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. And then, as we neared the crest, I saw them. 3 figures standing on the ridgeline, silhouetted against the morning sun. They were not assassins. They were waiting. They were still, and they blocked the only way home. The 3 figures standing on the spine of the world were not like the wraiths who had harried us from the shadows. These were men of iron and substance, clad in heavy lamellar armor that gleamed dully under furs, their faces uncovered and impassive as stone idols. They stood with the terrifying stillness of executioners who know the condemned has no path of escape. They were Mamluks, elite slave soldiers of the Sultan, likely the very commanders of the hunting party who had anticipated our desperate route and climbed the northern face to cut the throat of our hope. They held heavy curved Kilish swords, the steel etched with verses of the Quran, and round steel shields. We were 3 scarecrows, Hugh shivering with the poison of his wound, Thomas battering and exhausted, his breath rattling in his chest, and I, a cripple armed only with a dagger and a splintered shield, balancing on a leg that felt like a column of crushed glass. The wind whipped across the narrow ridge, tearing at our cloaks, but between us and the Mamluks, the air crackled with a silence more deafening than the gale. This was the end of the pilgrimage. There was no clever maneuver to be made, no cover to seek. There was only the narrow causeway of ice, the drop on either side, and the 3 wardens of death waiting to receive us. Thomas stepped forward, his movement stiff but possessed of a terrible, rigid dignity. He did not raise his sword. He simply planted his feet on the ice, making himself a wall between us and them. "They want the wood, brother," he said, his voice low and devoid of fear, stripped down to raw pragmatism. "They know what you carry. If they take it, the light goes out of the west." He looked back at me, his eyes vivid and piercing in his weather-beaten face. "I will open the door. You must walk through it. Do not look back. Do not hesitate. You run until your heart bursts or you reach the sea." I opened my mouth to protest, to say that we would stand and die together as the rule demanded, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It was not a request, it was a command from a superior officer, and more than that, it was a final testament. "Hugh," Thomas barked, "with me. One last charge, lad. For the temple." Hugh, pale as the snow around us, straightened. The fever seemed to burn away for a second, replaced by the clarity of the doomed. He nodded, gripping his sword with his good hand. "For the temple," he whispered. The Mamluks moved. They did not charge. They advanced with synchronized heavy steps, a grinding machine of steel. Thomas roared, a sound that seemed to tear his throat. "Beauséant!" and threw himself at the center figure. The collision was sickening, the sound of heavy armor smashing together like a hammer on an anvil. Hugh lunged at the man on the right, his blade moving with desperate speed. I was left alone with the third, a giant of a man who stepped past Thomas's flank, his eyes locked on my chest where the relic lay. I had no sword to parry the massive downward stroke of his keelage. Instinct took over, the raw animal panic that slows time. I dropped to my good knee, raising my shield at an angle. The blow landed with the weight of a falling tree. My shield shattered, the wood exploding into splinters, and the force drove my arm down, numbing it to the shoulder. I rolled, ignoring the scream of my bad leg, and scrambled across the ice. The Mamluk turned faster than a man of his size should be and kicked me. The boot caught me in the ribs, lifting me from the ground. I slammed into the rock, the breath driven from my lungs, darkness fringing my vision. I gasped for air, tasting copper. Through the haze, I saw Hugh fall. He had parried a blow but was too weak to hold his ground. The Mamluk's shield bash sent him reeling back, and a swift, merciless thrust took him in the throat. He collapsed without a sound, his blood instantly freezing on the white ground. "No!" I wheezed, struggling to rise. The man who killed Hugh turned towards Thomas, who was locked in a grapple with the leader, their blades grinding hilt to hilt. Thomas was fighting with the strength of a madman, headbutting the leader, hacking at his legs, but he was surrounded now. The giant who had kicked me loomed over me, raising his sword for the finishing stroke. He looked at me with not hatred, but mild curiosity. as one looks at a wounded insect before crushing it. I was dead. I knew it. And in that moment of acceptance, my hand brushed the hilt of my dagger, the small, plain blade I used to cut bread. It was laughable, but as the sword began its descent, I did not try to block. I threw myself forward inside the arc of the swing, embracing the pain of my ruined leg. I slammed into his waist, driving the dagger upward into the gap of his armor beneath the armpit. It was a desperate needle thrust of a move. The blade sank deep. The giant roared, a sound of shock and fury, and dropped his sword to grab me. His massive hands closed around my throat, lifting me off my feet. I hung there, choking, staring into his black eyes, feeling the life being crushed out of my windpipe. I twisted the dagger, ripping it sideways inside him. His grip convulsed, then slackened. He staggered back, coughing blood, and toppled sideways. We crashed to the ice together, but I rolled free, gasping, my throat on fire. I looked up. Thomas was on his knees. The leader's sword was buried in his shoulder, cleaving the mail. Yet Thomas still held the man's sword arm, pinning it, preventing him from withdrawing the blade. The third Mamluk was stepping in to finish him. Thomas saw me rise. His face was a mask of blood, but his eyes were clear, terrifyingly bright. "Go!" he screamed, spraying blood. "Run, you fool! Run!" I stood frozen, my soul tearing in half. To leave him was to brand myself a coward forever. To stay was to let the relic fall into the hands of the infidel. The choice was not between life and death. It was between two different kinds of damnation. I looked at the relic's outline under my tunic. I looked at Thomas, who was dying to buy me seconds. Honor was not standing and dying for pride. Honor was the mission. Honor was obedience. With a cry of pure anguish that hurt more than any wound, I turned my back on my brother. I scrambled past the melee, slipping on Hugh's blood, and threw myself towards the downward slope. "Allahu Akbar!" one of the Mamluks shouted behind me, realizing my intent. I heard heavy footsteps in pursuit, the crunch of boots on snow. I did not look back. I reached the edge of the ridge where the snow fell away in a steep, terrifying glissade of ice and rock. I didn't climb down. I jumped. It was an act of suicide, a surrender to gravity. I hit the slope and slid, tumbling, bouncing off rocks that battered my armor and cracked my bones. The world became a spinning kaleidoscope of white snow, gray rock, and blue sky. I gathered speed, uncontrollable and lethal. I curled into a ball, clutching the relic to my chest, praying for the end. I hit a patch of deep powder that swallowed me, slowing my descent, then tumbled over a ledge, falling through empty air for a heartbeat before crashing into a drift below. The impact knocked the consciousness out of me. When I woke seconds or minutes later, I was lying half buried in snow, my body a single throbbing bruise. I looked up at the ridge, hundreds of feet above. A small dark figure stood at the edge, looking down. It watched for a moment, then turned and vanished. They thought I was dead. Or perhaps the slope was too treacherous even for them. I lay there, staring at the sky, weeping. I wept not for the pain, nor for the relief of survival. I wept for Thomas. I wept for Hugh. I wept for the boy I had been, who thought war was banners and trumpets. I was alone in the white wilderness, a murderer of my own brothers, a coward who had run. But as I shifted, the box pressed against my ribs, hard and unyielding. The wood of the cross. I had saved it. I pulled it out with trembling, frozen fingers. The silver was dented, but the seal was unbroken. I held it up to the sun. It was just a piece of wood, a fragment of a torture device. But men, good men, better men than I, had died for it. Their blood was on my hands, but their trust was in this box. I forced myself to sit up. My leg was agony, but it would hold. It had to hold. I was no longer a knight. I was a vessel. I was a ghost carrying a memory. I stood swaying like a drunkard and turned my face to the west, towards the distant, unseen sea. The descent was far from over. I began to walk, leaving a trail of blood and drag marks in the pristine snow. Each step a penance, each breath a promise to the dead. The silence of the mountain was absolute, a cathedral built for mourning. The descent from the high passes was a journey through a landscape of blurred grays and muted greens, a fever dream where the only constant was the mechanical rhythm of my own limping stride. I do not remember sleeping. I do not remember eating, though my hands were stained with berries and the grit of road dust. I remember only the relentless pull of gravity and the weight of the wooden box against my ribs, a heartbeat of silver and ancient timber that seemed to drive me forward when my muscles had long since surrendered. The snow gave way to mud, the mud to dry scrub, and finally, the air changed. The sharp, metallic bite of the freezing peaks was replaced by the heavy, saline embrace of the sea. I heard the waves before I saw them, a rhythmic crashing that sounded like the breathing of a great beast, washing the shores of a land that had consumed my brothers. When the walls of Tortosa finally broke the horizon, looming dark and impregnable against the setting sun, I did not feel relief. I felt a profound, hollowing shame. I was returning a whole man, or nearly so, while Thomas and Hugh lay frozen on a ridge where the eagles would be their only undertakers. I was the wreckage that had washed ashore, the fragment that had refused to sink. I approached the postern gate at dusk. The guards on duty, men I had shared meals with, leveled their crossbows at the solitary, ragged figure emerging from the twilight. I must have looked like a revenant, my white surcoat torn to ribbons and stained with dried blood and pine pitch, my face gaunt, my eyes sunken into dark pits of exhaustion. "Halt!" one cried, his voice wavering. I stopped, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch of cedar. I pushed back the hood of my cloak, letting the dying light catch the ruined landscape of my face. "It is I rasped, my voice sounding like grinding stones. "Open the gate." The recognition was slow, followed by a flurry of movement and hushed curses. The heavy wood groaned open and hands reached out to support me. They asked questions, frantic, overlapping demands for news of the patrol, of the mountains, of the others. I pushed them away with a strength I did not know I possessed. "The Master," I said, staring through them. "Take me to the Master." Godfrey was in the chapel, kneeling in the shadows of the nave, the red sanctuary lamp casting long, dancing shadows against the stone arches. He stood as I limped in, the sound of my uneven gait echoing in the silence. He did not speak. He looked at me, his gaze sweeping over my battered frame, noting the absence of my sword, the absence of my horse, and most heavily, the absence of my brothers. He saw the story written in the slump of my shoulders and the dirt in my pores. I reached into my tunic, my fingers stiff and clumsy, and pulled out the box. I walked to the altar and placed it gently on the white cloth. It looked small there, insignificant. A simple container for a splinter of wood. "It is safe," I whispered, the words breaking the dam holding back my composure. "Thomas, Hugh, Bashir, they are not." I sank to my knees, the stone floor brutal against my ruined leg, but I welcomed the pain. It was a penance. "I left them," I confessed to the floor, to the Master, to God. Thomas held the line. He told me to run, and I ran. I chose the wood over my brothers. I chose to live. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man. I waited for the rebuke, for the stripping of my mantle, for the accusation of cowardice that I had been shouting at myself for 3 days. Instead, I felt a hand rest upon my head. It was heavy and warm. "Stand up, Knight of the Temple." Godfrey's voice was soft, devoid of the iron I was accustomed to. I looked up. His eyes were wet, filled with a sorrow so ancient it seemed carved into his face. "Do you think honor is only found in the tip of a lance?" he asked quietly. "Do you think the only path to God is to die on a pile of enemy corpses?" He walked to the altar and placed his hand on the box. Thomas knew what he was doing. He spent his life to buy this moment. If you had stayed, if you had thrown your life away for the vanity of dying together, his sacrifice would have been for nothing. The cross would be lost. You did the hardest thing a soldier can do, my son. You denied your pride. You accepted the burden of survival. He turned back to me, his face stern again, the commander returning. To die is easy. The dead do not have to wake up tomorrow and remember. The dead do not have to tend the wounds or bear the weight of the legacy. You have walked through the fire and carried the truth out with you. That is not cowardice. That is the highest discipline. He gestured to the infirmary brothers waiting in the shadows. Go. Heal. Pray for their souls, but do not dare to dishonor their memory by despising the life they bought for you. I allowed them to lead me away, the master's words ringing in my ears, fighting a war against the guilt in my heart. I was bathed, my wounds dressed with fresh linen and salves that smelled of myrrh. I was given food I could not taste and wine that did not dull the sharp edges of my memory. I slept, and in my dreams, I saw the snow again, red and white, and heard the wind screaming my name. Days turned into weeks. I remained at Tortosa, a ghost haunting the ramparts. I watched the new recruits training in the courtyard below, their laughter bright and brittle, their movements full of an energy I had lost forever. I was no longer one of them. The youth who had ridden out of Acre, terrified of fear itself, was dead. He had died in the valley, and his ghost had been exorcised on the mountain. In his place stood a man who understood the terrible calculus of our vows. I spent hours in the chapel, staring at the reliquary where the wood now rested, encased in gold and crystal. I traced the scars on my leg through the wool of my habit. They were my map, my history. I began to understand what Thomas had meant in the cave. God is in the silence. He was not in the glory of the charge, nor in the thunder of the hooves. He was in the quiet, agonizing choice to do what was necessary, regardless of the cost to one's soul. One evening, as the sun dipped into the sea, painting the water in hues of bruised purple and blood orange, the colors of the battlefield, I stood on the highest tower, looking east towards the mountains. They were jagged silhouettes against the darkening sky, the tomb of my brothers. I touched the hilt of the new sword I had been issued. It was heavy, cold, and impersonal. I was a Templar still. I would ride again. I would fight again. I would kill again, but I would never again fight for the thrill of it or for the fear of shame. I would fight because I was the wall. I was the keeper of the gate. I was the one who had been ordered to live. A bell tolled for vespers, a mournful, steady sound that called the faithful to prayer. I turned away from the mountains, from the past, and looked towards the chapel. I pulled my white mantle closer around my shoulders. It was no longer a costume of romance. It was a shroud, a uniform of service that I would wear until the day I was finally permitted to lay it down. I walked to the stairs, my limp pronounced but steady. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I had faced the ultimate enemy, not the Saracen, not the assassin, but the weakness of my own heart, and I had not broken. I had chosen the unglamorous, painful path of duty. I had chosen to be the bearer of the cross, not its martyr. And as I descended into the shadows of the fortress to kneel once more in the stone silence, I carried them with me. Thomas, Hugh, Bohemond. They were part of my armor now, invisible plates of steel protecting a heart that had been broken and reforged. I whispered the words of the psalm, the motto of our order, and for the first time I understood them not as a battle cry, but as a plea for forgiveness and a declaration of submission. Non nobis, Domine, non nobis, sed nomini tuo de gloriam. Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us. I walked into the darkness ready to serve, a knight of the temple, alone and unbroken.